My stepfather stood outside my gate, banging on a call box he used to own the code to, and for the first time in his life, Richard Coleman had no way of getting in. 6 months earlier, he told me I wasn't real family. He said it at my own mother's birthday dinner, in front of everyone we both loved, with a glass of wine in his hand and a smile still on his face, as if the words cost him nothing. I remember the silence after he said it. I remember my mother's fork stopping halfway to her mouth. I remember thinking that a man who had spent 17 years calling me his son had just told the truth for the first time in his life. And the truth was that I had never been his son at all. I was just the boy who paid for the roof over his head. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I finished my dinner, thanked my mother for a wonderful evening, and drove home in complete silence, past the gate of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. The house Richard Coleman had been living in for 3 years, without ever once putting his name on a single document tied to it. I sat in my driveway for almost an hour before I went inside, and in that hour, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because anger fades, and this didn't. What I felt was something colder, something that settled into my chest and stayed there, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to move. 6 months later, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning, when Richard Coleman pulled into my driveway with a moving truck full of furniture he had no business bringing into a house he didn't own, expecting the gate to open the way it always had, expecting the code he had memorized to still mean something. It didn't. He tried it 3 times before he understood. Then he tried the intercom, pressing the button again and again, his voice getting louder each time he said my name, my mother standing beside him in her coat, confused, asking him what was happening, asking him why the gate wouldn't open for the house she had lived in with her own son. Richard didn't answer her. He just kept pressing the button, because somewhere in the back of his mind, I think he already knew exactly why. I want to tell you how we got here, because this isn't a story about a locked gate. This is a story about what happens when a man spends his entire life being told he's not enough, and then builds something so undeniable that the same people who dismissed him have no choice but to come knocking. It's a story about my mother and the choice she had to make between the man she married and the son she raised. And it's a story about Richard Coleman, a man who believed that love could be measured in bloodlines, and who never once imagined that the boy he refused to call family would be the one holding the only key that mattered. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why that gate stayed shut, you have to go back almost 30 years, long before Richard Coleman ever walked into our lives, back to a small rented house in a working-class neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, where my mother raised me alone after my biological father left when I was 4 years old and never once looked back. I don't remember much about him, and honestly, I stopped trying to remember a long time ago. What I do remember is my mother working 2 jobs, coming home smelling like the diner she waitressed at, sitting at our kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, telling me everything was going to be fine, even when I could see in her eyes that she wasn't sure it would be. She never once made me feel like we were struggling, even when we were. That's the kind of woman my mother is. And it's important you understand that about her before I tell you what happens later, because everything she did, even the choices that hurt me, came from a place of trying to hold a family together. I ask 3 questions right now that will follow us through everything you're about to hear. How does a boy raised in that kind of hardship end up building a mansion with his own name on the deed? What does the phrase real family actually mean when love, blood, and money get tangled together in ways nobody ever prepares you for? And when the man who raised you finally reveals what he truly thinks of you, what does it cost him to hear you say it back? Keep those questions in mind, because by the end of this story, I think you'll have answers you didn't expect, and maybe some you don't fully agree with. And that's all right, because this story isn't clean, and neither was my life. Richard Coleman came into our lives when I was 9 years old. My mother met him at the diner where she worked, a regular customer who tipped well and always asked about her day, and for the first year, I thought he was the best thing that had ever happened to us. He fixed things around the house that had been broken for years. He showed up to my Little League games when my own father never had. He taught me how to change a tire and how to shake a man's hand properly, and for a long time, I called him Dad without anyone asking me to. My mother married him when I was 11, and I remember standing next to him at the courthouse, wearing a clip-on tie he'd bought me the day before, believing with my whole heart that I finally had a real family again. But there were small things, even in those early years, that I didn't understand until much later. When Richard's own children came to visit on weekends, Ethan and Vanessa, his son and daughter from a previous marriage, I noticed the difference in how he spoke to them versus how he spoke to me. It wasn't cruel, not back then. It was subtler than that. A birthday gift that cost twice as much. A compliment about a report card that only ever went to them. A family photo one Christmas where the caption underneath, written in his own mother's handwriting, read, Richard, Linda, and the kids, and then my name added almost as an afterthought below it, like I'd been left off the first draft and squeezed in later. I noticed. I didn't say anything, because I was young, and because my mother seemed happy, and because happiness in that house always felt fragile enough that I didn't want to be the one who broke it. By the time I was 16, I had already decided that I was going to build something of my own, something nobody could ever take credit for, or diminish the way Richard diminished almost everything I did. I got my first job at a hardware store, and within a year, I had saved enough to buy tools and start doing small repair jobs for neighbors on weekends. Richard found out and laughed, telling me at dinner one night that I should focus on getting decent grades instead of playing handyman, that real money didn't come from fixing fences for old ladies down the street. My mother defended me quietly, the way she always did, but Richard's opinion of my ambitions was already set, and it would stay set for the next 20 years, no matter how much evidence piled up against it. I graduated high school with decent grades and no college fund, because whatever money Richard made, it never seemed to stretch toward my future the way it stretched toward Ethan's tuition or Vanessa's car. I didn't resent him for it outright at the time, because I told myself that was simply how blended families worked, that a man wasn't obligated to pay for a child that wasn't biologically his. I took out loans, worked full-time, and enrolled in a local trade program for construction management, a decision Richard openly mocked at a family dinner, telling relatives that I was going to spend my life swinging a hammer while Ethan was going to law school. Nobody at that table corrected him. My mother looked down at her plate. I remember that detail more than almost anything else from those years, the way she looked down instead of looking at me. The trade program turned out to be the best decision I ever made. I threw myself into it completely, working construction sites during the day and taking night classes 3 times a week, learning everything I could about building, permitting, and eventually, small-scale development. By 23, I had saved enough to put a down payment on my first rental property, a rundown duplex on the edge of town that nobody else wanted, and I spent every weekend for a year renovating it myself. Richard called it a money pit the one time he bothered to visit. My mother, on the other hand, showed up almost every Saturday with lunch for me, sitting on an overturned bucket in the middle of a half-finished kitchen, telling me she was proud of me even when the house looked like it might fall down around us. That duplex became 2 properties, and 2 became 6, and by the time I was 28, I had started my own small development company, buying distressed properties, renovating them, and either renting or flipping them for a profit that, for the first time in my life, felt substantial. Richard's attitude didn't change much during this period, though it shifted in tone. Instead of mocking the work outright, he started making comments that were harder to argue with directly. Things like, "That'll never work long-term," or "You're one bad deal away from losing everything," or my personal favorite, delivered at a Thanksgiving dinner with a tone of false concern. "Someone should really teach you about real financial planning, son." He still called me son sometimes back then. That word would disappear from his vocabulary entirely a few years later, once it became clear exactly how successful I was becoming. And I think that timing tells you everything you need to know about what that word had actually meant to him all along. By the time I turned 32, my company had grown into something none of us, including me, ever expected. I had moved from residential flips into commercial development, and a series of successful projects in the Columbus area had put more money in my accounts than I ever imagined possible growing up in that small rented house, with my mother and her calculator full of unpaid bills. I bought my mother a car that year, a nice one, nothing flashy, but reliable and comfortable, something she deserved after decades of driving whatever second-hand vehicle happened to be running. Richard's reaction to that gift was the first time I saw real resentment flash across his face, without him bothering to hide it. He said, in front of my mother, that he could have bought her a car himself if I hadn't jumped the gun, and I remember thinking, quietly, that he'd had 17 years to buy her a car and never had. It was around this time that I decided to build the mansion, though I want to be clear that in my own head, I never once thought of it that way. To me, it was simply the house, the one I had been dreaming about since I was a teenager fixing fences for neighbors, the one that would finally give my mother the kind of comfort and security she had spent her whole life providing for me without ever receiving in return. I bought 11 acres of land about 20 minutes outside the city, hired an architect, and spent nearly a year designing every detail of that property myself, walking the land on weekends, imagining where the kitchen windows would catch the morning light, where my mother's garden would go, where I would eventually, though I didn't know it yet, install a gate with a keypad that would one day become the most important detail in this entire story. Construction took just over 18 months, and during that time, Richard's attitude shifted again, this time in a direction I genuinely did not expect. He started visiting the site more often, asking detailed questions about square footage and property value, offering unsolicited opinions about layout decisions that were not his to make. At first, I told myself he was simply proud of me, finally, after 2 decades of doubt. But there was a comment he made one afternoon, standing in the unfinished frame of what would become the living room, that I brushed off at the time, but that I now understand was the true beginning of everything that followed. He put his hand on my shoulder, looked around at the skeleton of the house rising around us and said, "Well, I suppose I did raise you, so in a way, this is as much mine as it is yours." I laughed it off. My mother, standing nearby, laughed it off too. Neither of us understood yet how seriously he meant it. The house was finished the spring I turned 34, and the day my mother walked through the front door for the first time, tears in her eyes, running her hand along the kitchen counter like she couldn't quite believe it was real, remains one of the best memories of my entire life. I told her that day that this house belonged to her as much as it belonged to me, that she would always have a place here no matter what happened in her life, and I meant every word of it. What I didn't fully account for was that Richard came as part of that promise, because he was her husband, and because separating the two of them was never something I considered. Not back then, not when I still believed, despite every warning sign over the previous 2 decades, that we were building towards something whole. I invited my mother and Richard to move into the guest wing of the property full-time about 8 months after the main house was completed, partly because I wanted my mother close, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me still wanted Richard's approval, still wanted him to look at what I had built and finally, after 25 years, say that he was proud of me without qualification. He accepted the offer almost immediately, and for the first several months, things were good. There were real moments of warmth during that period, holidays where Richard seemed to genuinely enjoy himself, a few evenings on the back porch where he talked to me almost like an equal for the first time in my life. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this story to paint him as a villain from the very beginning, because that wouldn't be honest. There were good months. I clung to them harder than I probably should have, because I wanted so badly for them to be the beginning of something permanent instead of the exception. But slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, Richard began treating the property less like a guest and more like an owner. He started making decisions without asking me, having a stand of trees near the guest house removed because he didn't like the shade they created, hiring a landscaping company for an entire section of the grounds, and simply forwarding me the invoice, inviting business associates of his own to use the pool house for gatherings, without ever mentioning it to me beforehand. When I brought these things up, gently at first, he would remind me, almost casually, that he had raised me, that this was as much his home as anyone's, echoing that comment he'd made back when the house was still just a frame of wooden beams. My mother, caught in the middle, would often smooth things over before they escalated, telling me that Richard didn't mean anything by it, that he was just settling in, that I should let it go for her sake. Vanessa, Richard's daughter, made her feelings clear almost from the beginning, telling extended family members at gatherings that I was, in her words, using the house to control everyone, that a man who needed to build a mansion to prove his worth clearly had something to compensate for. Ethan, on the other hand, Richard's son, never joined in on those comments, and in fact, on more than one occasion, quietly apologized to me for his sister's behavior, telling me privately that he thought I'd built something remarkable and that his father's attitude toward me had never made sense to him. I want you to remember Ethan's name, because he becomes important again much later in this story, in a way that I think will surprise you. The incident that I now consider the true turning point happened on a Tuesday evening about 1.5 years after Richard and my mother moved in, when I came home early from a business trip and overheard, through a partially open door, a phone conversation Richard was having with someone I couldn't identify at the time. He was talking about the property in terms that made my stomach turn, discussing something with an attorney friend of his about what he called protecting his interests in the estate, using language that implied he believed he had some legal claim to a house that existed entirely because of money I had earned, on land I had purchased, under a deed that carried only my name. I didn't confront him that night. I simply closed the door quietly and went to bed, but I didn't sleep, and the next morning, I called my own attorney for the first time, not with any specific plan yet, just to understand exactly where I stood. What my attorney told me over the following weeks was both reassuring and deeply unsettling at the same time. Reassuring because the property was entirely mine, the deed was clean, and no verbal claim Richard might make about having raised me held any legal weight whatsoever. Unsettling, because my attorney discovered, while reviewing some paperwork I'd forwarded from an earlier home equity conversation, that Richard had actually attempted, roughly 8 months earlier, to have his name added to certain property documents, using a notary he apparently knew personally, an attempt that had failed only because the specific documents required my direct signature and a level of verification he couldn't forge his way around. When I learned this, I sat in my truck in the parking lot outside my attorney's office for a long time before I could bring myself to drive home, because it meant that the warmth I had felt during those early months of living together had, on his end at least, coexisted the entire time with a quiet, calculated effort to take a piece of what I had built without ever telling me. I didn't say anything to Richard about what I'd discovered. I decided, instead, to watch and wait, to see whether the man who had raised me, whatever his flaws, would eventually show me who he really was, without my having to force the issue. I didn't have to wait long. The moment came 3 months later at my mother's 60th birthday dinner, a celebration I had planned and paid for entirely myself, held in the main dining room of the house, with roughly 30 guests, including extended family, a few of my mother's oldest friends, and Richard's siblings visiting from out of state. It was, by every measure, meant to be one of the best nights of my mother's life, and for the first 2 hours, it was. The moment everything changed came during the toasts, when Richard, several glasses of wine into the evening, stood up to speak about my mother and, in the middle of an otherwise sentimental speech, made an offhand comment directed at one of his visiting siblings, gesturing around the room and saying that it was remarkable what a person could build for themselves when they had, in his words, the right people guiding them along the way. His brother, not fully understanding the tension in the room, laughed and asked whether he meant me, since I was the one who had actually built the company and the house we were all sitting in. Richard's response, delivered with the same casual smile he'd worn 20 years earlier when he mocked my hardware store job, was the sentence that changed the entire trajectory of my life. He said, and I remember every word of it exactly, "You're not real family, David. You never were. You just happened to write the checks." The table went completely silent. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, exactly the way I described at the very beginning of this story, and I watched her face shift through disbelief, then embarrassment, then a kind of frozen uncertainty, as though she didn't yet know whether to defend her husband or her son. And in that silence, that uncertainty told me almost as much as Richard's words had. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything or storm out of the room the way you might expect from a story like this. I sat perfectly still for a moment, looked at the man who had raised me for 25 years, and asked him one simple question that I had already, quietly, confirmed the answer to weeks earlier. I asked him, "Whose name is on the deed, Richard?" He didn't answer. Nobody at that table said a word. I finished the evening as though nothing had happened, because I refused to let Richard Coleman ruin my mother's 60th birthday any further than he already had. And I want you to understand that decision, because it tells you something important about the difference between how he and I handled conflict. He said cruel things easily, in front of an audience, without hesitation. I said nothing that night, because I had already decided, somewhere in the silence after his comment, exactly what I was going to do, and I didn't need an audience for it. I drove my mother's guests home myself when the evening ended, hugged my mother goodnight, and did not speak to Richard at all before he went to bed in the guest wing of the house. He had just told a room full of people didn't really belong to him after all, in spirit if not in law. Over the following 6 months, I did nothing that Richard or anyone else in that house would have noticed, which was exactly the point. I met with my attorney twice more, this time to formalize a family trust that placed the property, along with several other assets, into a structure that would be nearly impossible for anyone outside my immediate legal designation to challenge, ever, under any circumstance. I quietly updated the security system on the property, a process that took several weeks and involved a company Richard never once asked about, because why would he, since as far as he knew, nothing had changed. I spoke privately with my mother exactly once during this period, not about Richard directly, but about her own feelings, asking her gently whether she was happy, whether she felt safe, whether she had ever truly felt like an equal partner in her marriage to a man who had just told a room full of people that her only son wasn't real family. She didn't have an answer for me that day. I didn't push her. I simply told her that whatever she decided, I would always have a place for her, and I meant it. About 4 months after the birthday dinner, Richard did something I genuinely did not expect, which was to apologize. He came to me on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sat across from me on the back porch, and told me that he had been drinking too much that night, that he hadn't meant what he said, that he had let years of pride and insecurity about not being my biological father come out in the worst possible way. He asked if we could start over, if I could forgive him, if we could go back to being the family he claimed we had once been. Some part of me wanted desperately to believe him, the same part of me that had called him Dad without being asked when I was 9 years old, the same part that had spent decades quietly hoping for his approval. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I told him I needed time. What I didn't know at the time, and what I only discovered roughly 6 weeks later, was that Richard's apology had almost nothing to do with genuine remorse, and everything to do with something Vanessa had overheard during a phone call with my attorney's office, a call she happened to be present for during a visit, in which the words family trust and property restructuring had been mentioned in passing. Ethan, true to the character I'd come to respect over the years, called me directly one evening and told me, uncomfortable but honest, that he'd overheard his father telling Vanessa on the phone to, in his words, just play nice until the paperwork is settled, referring to whatever legal changes he suspected I was making, hoping that a temporary peace would buy him enough time to either discover my plans or find some way to interfere with them before they became permanent. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly had to. The apology I had almost let myself believe had never been about my mother's marriage or about repairing our relationship. It had been about buying time. That phone call from Ethan was, in many ways, the final piece I needed. I finalized the trust documents within the week, transferred every remaining asset that needed protecting, and changed every access code, every gate credential, and every security clearance associated with the property, all without a single word of warning to Richard or Vanessa, though I did have one last private conversation with my mother, telling her exactly what I was planning to do and exactly why, and giving her, one final time, the choice to decide where she wanted to stand. She cried during that conversation, more than I had seen her cry in years, but she did not ask me to stop. The morning Richard pulled into the driveway with a moving truck full of furniture, the same morning I described to you at the very beginning of this story, was not, as he assumed, an ordinary Tuesday. He had spent the previous weekend, apparently, quietly moving additional belongings into the guest house without asking, treating the apology period as though it had already restored him to full ownership of a home he had never owned to begin with, and the moving truck represented, as I later learned, an attempt to formally relocate the last of his and Vanessa's things from a storage unit they'd been keeping since a minor renovation months earlier. He had no idea, walking up to that gate with a coffee in his hand and a satisfied look on his face, that every code he knew had already been erased from the system for 11 days. I watched the entire scene from the study window on the second floor of the house, the same room where I had first overheard him on the phone with his attorney friend nearly 2 years earlier, and I want to tell you honestly that there was no triumphant feeling in that moment, no satisfaction the way you might expect from a story like this. What I felt, watching Richard press that intercom button again and again, watching my mother stand beside him in her coat, visibly confused and increasingly distressed, was something closer to grief. Grief for the family I had wanted so badly to have. Grief for the version of Richard I had believed existed when I was 9 years old fixing a leaky faucet alongside him. Grief for 2 decades I would never get back. But grief does not change facts, and the fact was that I had built something real, on land I had earned, and the man standing outside my gate had made it unmistakably clear, more than once, exactly how little that meant to him until the moment he needed it. I walked down to the gate myself, alone, and stood on my side of it, while Richard continued pressing the intercom, his voice rising with each attempt, demanding to know what kind of joke I was playing, telling me through the speaker that this was, in his words, completely unacceptable behavior toward the man who raised him. I let him finish. Then I pressed the button on my side and spoke calmly, the way I had learned to speak to difficult contractors and stubborn business partners over 15 years of building a company from nothing. I told him that he had said, in front of 30 people at my own mother's birthday dinner, that I wasn't real family, that I simply wrote the checks, and that I had spent the last several months making sure that from this point forward, that statement would be entirely, permanently true. I told him that real family doesn't need a key to feel like they belong somewhere, and that he had never needed one either. He had simply been given one, freely, and had spent every year since treating it like an entitlement instead of a gift. My mother, standing beside him, began to cry, and I want to be honest with you that this was the hardest part of the entire process for me, harder than any legal document or any confrontation with Richard himself, because I had never once wanted to hurt her. I told her, through the intercom, that the gate would open for her the moment she wanted it to, that nothing I had done was meant to punish her, and that she would always have a place inside these walls, regardless of what she decided about her marriage. I watched her look at Richard, then look back toward the gate, and for a long moment she didn't move at all, caught between 20 years of marriage and the son she had raised alone before that marriage ever began. What happened over the following weeks became, in its own quiet way, more significant than the confrontation at the gate itself. My mother did not immediately leave Richard, and I want to be honest about that rather than give you a cleaner story than the truth actually was, because real families rarely resolve themselves as quickly or as neatly as we might want them to. She stayed with him for almost 2 months after that morning, splitting her time between a hotel near their old neighborhood and brief visits to see me, visits during which she never once asked me to reopen the gate for Richard, but also never fully said the words I was waiting to hear. During that period, I learned something about Richard that changed the entire shape of this story. Something Ethan brought to me almost reluctantly, sitting across from me at a coffee shop with a folder of old documents he had found while helping his father move out of the property he could no longer access. The documents Ethan brought me detailed something Richard had apparently done once before, decades earlier, with his first wife, Ethan and Vanessa's own biological mother, a woman I had heard mentioned only in passing over the years. According to those old records, and according to Ethan's own memory of conversations overheard as a teenager, Richard had spent years slowly asserting control over property and finances that belonged to his first wife's family, only to be pushed out entirely once she discovered what he had been quietly attempting to do, an almost identical pattern to what I had lived through myself, separated by more than 20 years and an entirely different family. Ethan told me, with a kind of quiet sadness I won't forget, that he had spent his whole life assuming his father's coldness toward outsiders was simply a personality trait, and only now, watching it happen again to me, did he understand that it had never been personality at all. It had been a pattern, repeated, refined, and nearly successful a second time. When my mother learned what Ethan had uncovered, something in her finally shifted in a way that 6 months of my own arguments and evidence had never quite managed to shift on their own. I don't know exactly what was said between her and Richard during their final conversation, because I wasn't there, and I never asked her to relive it for my benefit. But I know that she left the hotel 2 days later, moved into the guest wing of my house permanently, and filed for divorce from Richard Coleman within the month. She did not do this because of anything I said to her at the gate that morning. She did it because she finally saw, laid out in old paperwork and her stepson's uncomfortable honesty, the full shape of a pattern she had spent 20 years unable to see clearly from the inside. The divorce itself was, by most standards, relatively uncomplicated, largely because there was almost nothing of mine for Richard's attorney to make a credible claim toward, a fact that infuriated him, according to my mother, though by that point his opinion mattered very little to either of us. Vanessa stopped speaking to our family entirely after the divorce was finalized, and I have not heard from her since, which I have made a kind of peace with over time. Ethan, on the other hand, remained close to my mother and, gradually, close to me as well, and roughly a year after everything settled, I did something I hadn't necessarily planned, but that felt, once the opportunity arose, like the most natural decision in the world. I helped Ethan put a down payment on a small business he had been dreaming about for years, a modest auto shop outside Columbus, not because I owed him anything, but because he had chosen honesty over loyalty to his own father, at real personal cost, and in my experience, that kind of character deserves to be recognized rather than simply thanked and forgotten. I think about that dinner often, the one where Richard said I wasn't real family, and I've come to believe that he accidentally told me something true that night, though not in the way he intended. Family was never about the name on a deed, or the blood shared between two people, or the years spent under the same roof. It was about who showed up when things were hard, and who only showed up when there was something to gain. My mother showed up for me when I had nothing, working double shifts to keep a roof over our heads when I was a child who could offer her nothing in return. Ethan showed up for me when it cost him his relationship with his own father. And Richard, for all his years in that house, only ever truly showed up the day the gate stopped opening for him. I don't know if Richard Coleman ever fully understood what he lost that night at my mother's birthday dinner, or whether he still believes, somewhere, that he was simply speaking an uncomfortable truth about money and family that the rest of us were too soft to admit. Maybe he was right about something, in his own way, just not in the way he meant it. Real family was never about the checks I wrote. It was about everything I built despite him, and everyone who chose to stand beside me once it was finished. Would you have opened that gate for someone who spent 20 years telling you that you didn't belong? Would you have believed the apology, or seen through it the way I eventually did? I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done in my position. So tell me in the comments below, and if this story meant something to you, stay close, because I have more real stories like this one still to tell.